Today on the Perception in Action podcast, the second episode in my series looking at the use of virtual environments in sports. Let's evaluate the evidence for virtual environments as a training tool in sports. Do they produce similar movements? Preserve expertise differences? Lead to transfer of training? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, the second in my three-part series on virtual environment usage in sports. In the final part in the series, I will look at what we have learned about perceptual motor control from the use of virtual reality in the lab, discussing some clever ways that researchers have created impossible situations to test hypotheses. But today I want to focus on training. If you're a team owner, general manager, or coach, should you waste your time and/or money on training in a virtual environment? Is there any proof they work? Now, I wish I could spend the next half hour telling you about tons of studies that have used properly designed experiments and evaluated transfer of training to real sports, but alas, there are very, very few published studies of that nature. So, I'm going to save them to the end. Even though transfer should always be the ultimate goal of a training simulation, I think there are other things we can look at. What I'm going to do is answer a series of questions that to me address issues that are necessary but not sufficient for positive transfer of training to occur. So let's get rolling. Question number 1. Have virtual environments achieved perceptual fidelity? As I discussed in my last episode, perceptual fidelity refers to the extent to which a simulation looks, feels, and sounds like the environment it's trying to simulate. On the one hand, a lot of the aspects of perceptual fidelity designers seem to fuss over are, in my opinion, not really important for achieving transfer. Things like the detail of the pitcher avatar, the crowd sounds, etc. However, it is crucial that the simulation reliably and accurately simulate the perceptual information the athlete is using to act. Here I'm referring to things like the laces on the surface of a ball, the perceived size of gaps between opponents, and the speed and perceived angle of movement of objects. As I discussed in detail back in episode 53 when looking at direct learning, if we don't simulate these things correctly, we run the risk of having an athlete become attuned to a perceptual variable that works in the simulation but will be non-specifying in the real environment, which will most likely lead to negative transfer, as they will have to unlearn the control strategy they developed in the simulation. For example, imagine if the way we are simulating texture on a baseball causes it to flicker when the ball is thrown faster. We are incredibly good at picking up artifactual information sources like this that are useful for the task at hand, even if we're not consciously aware of it. I've personally had a couple experiments spoiled because of this exact reason. For example, check out my research confession way back in episode 5. By far, the biggest issue that has been identified in terms of perceptual fidelity of virtual environments has been perceived distance. It has been consistently shown that users underestimate the distance of objects in most simulators. That is, the objects look closer than they really are. This effect can be quite large too. For example, for HMDs, errors in perceived distance can be up to 50%. So when we try to simulate an object 20 feet away, the user will see it as being 10 feet away. For large screen display systems like caves, this effect is usually still present, but to a much lesser degree. For example, in a study published in 2005, Plumbert and colleagues asked participants to estimate the time it would take to walk to a target, presented in a real environment, a field, and in a virtual environment consisting of 3 large screens. For distances over about 60 feet, people did make large underestimates of distance, but these were similar for both the real and virtual environment. Why do people tend to underestimate distance in a virtual environment, particularly with HMD? The most common explanation that has been put forth over the years is what is called divergence accommodation conflict. When we fixate our eyes on a distant object, two things automatically happen to bring it into focus. First, our eyes turn so that the center of our retina, called the fovea, is aligned with the object in a process called vergence. And second, muscles in our eye contract or expand so as to adjust the shape of our lens, such that the light reflected off the object is focused on the retina in a process called accommodation. Both of these are distance dependent. For closer objects, our eyes need to turn in more, and our lens needs to be made more round. In the real world, these two processes work in perfect harmony, but in a virtual environment, there can be a problem. This can be illustrated by thinking about a 3D movie. When watching the movie, the objects are projected onto the screen, but are perceived to be at another distance, usually closer to you than the screen. When this happens, our eyes verge to the perceived distance of the object, but accommodate to the distance of the screen, creating a conflict. This results in a depth percept that is based on the average of the two distances. The improved optics in more recent HMDs like Oculus have gone some way to improving this, but as far as I know, it still exists. Is this underestimation of distance in virtual environments really an issue in terms of sports training? Well, for me, it's actually been a real thorn in my side over the years. On the one hand, since we don't seem to use perceived distance to control a lot of the actions we perform in sports, as I discussed back in episode 5, it's not really important that we be able to accurately judge it. For example, back in 1999, Martin Regan and I conducted a study where observers had to estimate the time to collision of a simulated approaching ball. The key manipulation in the study was that we used equipment you might see at an ophthalmologist's office to refract people's vision to one of two distances, 1 meter or 5 meters. All other aspects of the object, such as its rate of expansion, were the same. What did we find? Even though in one condition the ball looked like it was 5 times further away, there was no difference in the time to collision estimates. So how far away things look don't really affect sports relevant perceptual information. But on the other hand, I constantly have experienced baseball players that use my simulation tell me things don't quite look right, including the pitcher's mound seeming too close and the ball looking bigger than it does in real baseball. For some experiments, I've actually moved the simulated mound distance to further away until it seems right to the experienced players perceptually. But consistent with my earlier research I just mentioned, I found this actually has no effect on their batting performance in the simulator. A more problematic issue in terms of perceptual fidelity is the proper simulation of the texture on surface of objects. More specifically, how the texture changes as the object gets closer. Unlike the perceived distance issue, research has shown this can be a problem. For example, in another study Martin and I conducted in 1999, we found that when the change of surface texture of an approaching object is not consistent with its change in image size, it leads to an underestimate of time to collision. So adding texture, but not having it change properly, can be detrimental to performance. Question number 2. Have virtual environments achieved functional fidelity? To what extent do users behave like they would on a real field when placed in a sports simulation? Before diving into the research on this, I want to further subdivide functional fidelity into absolute and relative. Imagine while playing real baseball, my bat velocity while taking a swing in the first inning was 40 miles per hour, then it dropped to 35 miles per hour in the ninth inning due to fatigue. For a virtual environment to have absolute functional fidelity, I should get those two exact same values when I go through a simulated baseball game. So in other words, behavior should be exactly the same as it is in the real world. For relative functional fidelity, on the other hand, the actual values might be different, but my behavior changes in the same way as the conditions change. So if in the simulation I swung at 35 miles per hour in the first inning and 30 miles per hour in the ninth inning, then there is good relative validity. Although the actual numbers are different, the same pattern of change, a drop of 5 miles per hour during the game, was observed. I don't have any research to back this up, but I've always believed that relative functional fidelity is sufficient for training and understanding sports skills. Essentially, what we're trying to achieve in a virtual environment is learning to couple perceptual information with action and adapt to different conditions. So as long as the way my behavior changes in response to changes in the environment is the same, then I think we're on the right track, even if the absolute values are off a bit. But anyways, let's look at some research that has been done on this issue. It's probably not surprising to anyone, but research has shown that VR sports systems designed primarily for entertainment purposes, like the Microsoft Kinect, Nintendo Wii, or Sony Move games, tend to have very poor functional fidelity. In a 2014 study, Buffton and colleagues compared playing real table tennis with playing the games in these three gaming systems I just mentioned. The participants produced larger, by 18 degrees on average, and faster, by 2 meters per second on average, movements while hitting the virtual ball as compared to the real table tennis ball. Furthermore, how these stroke parameters changed with backhand and forehand strokes was different for real and virtual. So in other words, poor relative and absolute functional fidelity. But with more advanced virtual environments designed for training, the story is a bit better. In 2015, Chen and colleagues compared real bicep curls with those made in a virtual environment using a cave system. The simulation had poor absolute fidelity, as the EMG associated with lifting a virtual object was consistently higher than for a real one. However, there was good relative functional fidelity, as the effect of increasing the weight produced similar changes in EMG activity and similar ratings of perceived exertion in the real and virtual conditions. In 2011, Magdalon and colleagues compared the kinematics of reaching and grasping movements when picking up a real object versus those made in a virtual environment comprised of an HMD and a cyber glove. Again, there seemed to be good relative functional fidelity, as the trajectory of movements were similar and the scaling of grip size as a function of object size was similar in both environments. However, compared to the real environment, movements in the VR were slower and had longer deceleration times, and overall grip apertures were wider. Turning to simulations of sporting skills, in 2003, Bideau and colleagues compared the movements of a handball goalkeeper when making real saves and attempting to save a ball in a handball virtual environment. This included an avatar of a shooter that was animated using motions that were captured from a real player. The display consisted of 3 large projection screens, and only one goalkeeper was tested. There were no differences between the displacement of the center of mass for the arm or leg of the keeper in the real and virtual conditions. The final study I wanted to mention on this topic was conducted by Kovacci and colleagues in 2015. They compared real and virtual basketball free throw shooting. In particular, they were interested in comparing how the flight of the ball after release might differ between the two. The shooting performance of 20 novice participants was compared for real shots and shots made in a virtual environment comprised of a large screen stereoscopic display, with a front screen, a floor screen, and 2 side screens. In the simulation, participants shot a real ball that was cleverly attached to a rope and weight so that it didn't hit the screens. After each shot, observers received feedback about the ball's flight. They also had a third condition in which the display was augmented to help produce the optimal shot trajectory, but I'll tell you about that in a few moments. What was found? Shots made in the virtual environment had higher ball speed, higher height of ball release, and higher angle when the ball entered the basket, compared with the real condition. So again, poor absolute fidelity. They didn't really vary the conditions in the simulation, so relative fidelity could not be assessed. So what's going on here? Why is there consistently poor absolute functional fidelity in virtual environments? And is there any rhyme or reason to the differences between real and virtual movements? Well, I think a lot of it can be explained by referring back to the issue I addressed in my first question, perceptual fidelity. As I discussed, one of the main issues that has arisen in virtual environments is accurately simulating object locations. Users tend to underestimate perceived distance, and with the relatively narrow fields of view used in many VR systems, they do not have a good sense of where their body is positioned in the environment. Let's look at the results of the study I just talked about in terms of these perceptual distortions. When reaching to a stationary target, people use an unnaturally wide grip and move more slowly. These both make sense if you're not quite sure exactly where the target is located. Similarly, when shooting at a non-moving basketball hoop, if you can't perceive its distance very well, it makes sense to launch the ball at a higher angle so that it will come down at a larger angle, and this gives you more margin for error at the rim. Turning to the studies involving hitting moving objects, it was found that people tend to move faster in the virtual environment than in the real one. On the surface, this may sound counterproductive because of the well-known speed-accuracy trade-off, but it's actually not. In a real nice series of studies, Ellie Brenner and colleagues have shown that moving more quickly is actually an effective strategy when you're unsure about an object's location. Moving quickly means that any misperception of location will result in a smaller timing error. It's also the case that faster movements are more repeatable. So, in sum, it seems like the movements observed in most virtual environments are appropriate adaptations made by the user. Question number 3. Can virtual environments produce realistic levels of pressure and anxiety in an athlete? One of the proposed benefits of using virtual environments is being able to acclimatize an athlete to the big stage of an event. Work in other fields provides strong evidence that it is possible to recreate physiological and psychological arousal in a simulation. For example, VR exposure therapy is a technique actively used to treat mental health conditions, including many phobias and post-traumatic stress disorder. In this area, it has also been shown that relatively low-fidelity, low-immersion systems can be used to trigger anxiety. In sports, a virtual environment can be used to simulate large crowds and recreate specific high-pressure situations, like a free throw to win a basketball game. But do they actually make an athlete feel competitive performance anxiety? And will training with this subsequently result in reduced anxiety when the athlete is in the real situation? There are a couple studies that have provided some crude qualitative evidence of this. For example, prior to the 2002 Olympics, Sorrento and colleagues used the HMD to present 5 speed skaters from the Canadian Olympic team with a virtual environment of the Salt Lake City Olympic Oval that they would be competing in. There was no way for the athletes to interact with the display, so it wasn't really a true virtual environment. The athletes that used this reported reduced anxiety and felt that it was an effective visualization tool for developing a race plan. A somewhat contradictory finding was reported by Wellner and colleagues in a study using a rowing simulation. Adding a crowd to the simulation had no effect on movement patterns, physiological variables, or perceived anxiety. By far the most comprehensive study of competitive anxiety in sports simulations was conducted by Stinson and Bowman in 2014. In this study, a simulation of soccer penalty kicks, from the goalkeeper's perspective, was created using a cave environment. 22 students participated in the study, some of which had previous soccer experience, and 5 of which had played goalkeeper before. Their task involved saving 15 penalty shots in 8 different conditions. Dependent measures included heart rate, galvanic skin response, the competitive state anxiety questionnaire, and of course, save performance. 3 different things were manipulated: the field of view, the simulation fidelity, and the presence or absence of anxiety-inducing elements. For the field of view manipulation, the low condition involved turning only the front screen in the cave on, which results in a 90-degree display, while the high condition involved using all screens, resulting in a 270-degree display. For the fidelity manipulation, in the low condition only the field, net, kicker, and ball were visible, while in the high condition, a large stadium with a crowd, large scoreboard, and teammates were added. This also included the addition of crowd sounds. Finally, for the anxiety manipulation, the high anxiety condition was structured to make the participant feel a lack of control, unpredictability, and receive negative feedback. To introduce unpredictability, the time delay between kicks randomly varied between 0 and 16 seconds. To introduce negative feedback, a large comment, "Your performance is poor, please try harder," was displayed after every 3 misses. Finally, to introduce lack of control, the outcome of the shot, either a save or a goal, was actually predetermined before each shot and was not dependent on the user's movements. For me, this is a major design flaw. Decoupling the user's actions from the results is essentially reducing the fidelity of the simulation and would likely change the user's behavior. So it's not really just an anxiety manipulation in my mind. But anyways, what was found? As compared to a pretest baseline measure, in the virtual environment there was an increase in both the subjective and physiological measures of anxiety. However, unfortunately the pretest measurements were made when the participant was just sitting there doing nothing. So it's not clear to what extent the increase in heart rate, galvanic skin response, etc. in the sim were due to just being more physically active. In terms of the field of view manipulation, the results were opposite to what the authors predicted, as participants were more anxious with the less realistic small 90-degree display than with the large 270-degree one. The authors suggest that this occurred because the small display recreates the tunnel vision kind of effect many athletes feel under pressure, which I talked about back in episode 27. However, I would argue that an even more plausible explanation can be derived by looking at the fidelity issues I discussed a while ago. With a small field of view, there is more uncertainty of one's own position and that of other objects, which is likely to make a participant less confident and more anxious about their ability to save the ball. For the fidelity manipulation, only subjective anxiety measured by questionnaires significantly increased from the low to high condition. Interestingly, for save performance, there was a significant interaction between field of view and fidelity. Increasing the field of view resulted in more saves by the keeper, but only in the low fidelity condition. The authors argued that this may have been a distraction effect, as more of the crowd and stadium were present when the field of view was larger. Finally, there was also an interesting relationship between fidelity and previous soccer experience. For participants with no goalkeeping experience, anxiety increased when fidelity was increased, while for the 5 real keepers, there was no significant change. Overall, despite its flaws, I think this is an interesting study that shows competitive anxiety, as assessed by both physiological and subjective measures, can be induced effectively in a sports virtual environment. It also emphasizes a point I was trying to make in my last episode when talking about simulator evaluation. In terms of behavioral outcomes, having better technology, such as having higher physical fidelity and wider field of view, is not always necessarily better. And finally, we see in the study that the optimal simulation parameters may be different for athletes at different skill levels, a point I will return to later.
I wanna get caught in unchained thought, and hope is so real. It's so real.
Question number 4. Do virtual environments preserve expertise differences? A basic smell test of whether or not you're doing a good job simulating a sport is assessing whether or not athletes that are better at the real thing are also those that are better in the virtual environment. Over the years, I've evaluated this for my batting sim, and I've seemed to pass this test. Across 10 different studies, I've found significant correlations between batting average in the simulator and batting average from real league play, with an average correlation of about 0.65. Also, in a study I'm currently writing up for publication, I found significant correlations between real and virtual swing parameters like exit velocity and launch angle. Finally, over the years, I've rarely used complete novices in my baseball studies because I've found, similar to the real game, that unless I massively reduce pitch speeds, they can't hit the ball at all. Another example of a sports simulation in which expertise differences seem to have been reliably reproduced is the soccer goalkeeping virtual environment used by Joost Dessing and Kathy Craig to study curve-free kicks. Specifically, relative to less experienced participants, the expert goalkeeper tested in the study tended to wait a bit longer before initiating movement, thus gaining more information about the ball trajectory, an effect that has also been observed in real performance. I'm unaware of any other comparisons that have been made in other sports simulations, as most studies use novice, unexperienced participants. Question number 5. Is the pattern of motor learning similar in real and virtual environments? Similar to a real environment, participants do show clear perceptual and motor learning effects in virtual environments. For example, with reference to the distance misperception problem I've been talking about, if you allow a user to explore a virtual environment by walking or reaching out to objects, their distance perception gets recalibrated and becomes more accurate. But are the underlying motor learning processes similar for the two environments? In a 2009 study, Nukuyan and Zadpour examined the task of learning to reach in the presence of a force field in a real and virtual environment. In the real environment, the force field was created using a robotic arm, while in the VR it was conveyed visually. When the force field was applied suddenly, patterns of learning were similar. For example, the learning generalized from the non-dominant to the dominant arm in both cases. However, these effects were not the same when the force field was introduced gradually. In a recent 2017 study, Anglin and colleagues compared adaptation to a visual perturbation for a real versus a virtual environment using an HMD. In this task, participants had to learn to point to a target on the screen that rotated 45 degrees clockwise after they started their movement. They chose this task because research in real environments has shown that it can be learned in two distinctly different ways. Under some conditions, it seems to be learned very implicitly, based on low-level error detection mechanisms, while in other conditions, learning seems to be more cognitive and involves an explicit strategy. The degree to which learning is implicit or explicit is assessed by asking participants to indicate where their planned aiming point on the screen will be before the start of the trial. For those using an explicit strategy, the differences between the indicated and actual movement are smaller than for those using an implicit strategy. In this study, 12 participants learned the task using a real computer screen, while a separate 12 learned using a screen simulated in the HMD. What was found? For target error, that is the difference between the actual location of the target and where they pointed, there was no significant differences between the real and virtual group at any point in the training. This was also true when reaction time was analyzed. So in other words, both groups showed the same degree of learning or adaptation. There was, however, a significant difference in how they adapted to the task. Specifically, the difference between the planned aiming angle and the actual aiming angle of the pointing movement was smaller for the group that used the HMD than in the real environment, suggesting that a more cognitive, explicit strategy was used in the virtual environment. This finding actually agrees with a lot of what I've experienced with virtual environments over the years. In general, it can take a lot of cognitive effort from a user to make the action seem realistic in a simulation. For example, when hitting a ball in a simulation, the image of the ball will often go out of view because it goes off the edge of the screen, thus requiring the user to do some mental extrapolation of its trajectory. Given that it takes this kind of effort on the part of the user, it's not unreasonable to me to expect more explicit learning in the virtual environment. And given the many benefits of implicit learning, which I discussed back in episode 16, this may not be such a good thing. So I think it's an important issue to address. I'm unaware of any sports-related studies that have done this in a virtual environment, but it would be interesting to see if techniques known to produce implicit learning in real environments, like training with a dual task, errorless learning, or learning by analogy, produce similar effects in a sports simulation. Question number 6. Do virtual environments make training more enjoyable and increase the motivation to put in long training hours? On this front, virtual environments do seem to have a clear win, especially when looking at endurance sports like running, cycling, and rowing in comparison to standard indoor trainers like a treadmill or rowing machine. It has been consistently shown that training with a virtual environment fosters more user enjoyment and motivation and increases the amount of time they're willing to spend training or exercising. For those interested in this type of research, I would recommend the review paper by Newman published in 2016. However, I should make one caveat here. It is unlikely that benefits of the same magnitude will occur when looking at sports that involve hand-eye coordination. It is likely that in these type of simulations, things like eye fatigue and simulator sickness could offset any benefits from a more motivating environment. Question number 7. Do virtual environments encourage a more external focus of attention? It has been proposed by some that the novelty and uniqueness of a virtual environment may encourage athletes to have a more external focus of attention during training, which can be beneficial, especially for those with previous experience in the sport. In 2011, Daniel Mestri and colleagues compared focus of attention when cycling on a standard exercise bike versus a bike that was connected to a virtual environment. Focus of attention was evaluated by having participants rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how much they were attending to their own internal body sensations. There was a clear dissociative role of using the VR, as ratings of attending to internal signals like body pain and fatigue were significantly lower when cycling in the virtual environment. In 2016, Orman investigated focus of attention effects produced by training in a music conducting simulation. As compared to a control group, the group that trained in the VR made more eye contact with musicians, suggesting a more external focus during a post-test that involved conducting a real orchestra. Related to this focus of attention idea, it's been proposed that using a virtual environment may be an effective way to keep an athlete from focusing their attention on their injured body part when recovering, and provide a safer and more controlled environment for them to rehab. This idea was explored in a recent study by Gokeller and colleagues. In this study, 20 athletes recovering from ACL knee surgery and 20 healthy controls performed a step-down task in a virtual environment with 2 levels of fidelity. The low-fidelity environment depicted a traffic light which changed from red to green projected on a large screen. The high-fidelity condition involved a traffic environment depicting a city street with high buildings and a crosswalk with a pedestrian traffic light and cars projected on the screen passing from left to right. Traffic noise was also added in this condition. Motion trackers and force plates were used to measure kinematics and kinetics. What was found? There was a significant interaction between group and condition, as increasing from low to high fidelity had a much larger effect on the ACL recovery patients than in the control group. In the high fidelity condition, the ACL group had a larger range of knee movements and higher vertical ground forces as compared to the low fidelity environment. This pattern of results is what would be expected if the ACL group shifted from an internal to external focus in the high-fidelity condition. So, there seemed to be some indication that a performer's focus of attention might be more external in a virtual environment, but more work needs to be done to evaluate this effect in sporting contexts.
Separate reality.
Question number 8. Can augmented information be effectively implemented in a virtual environment? Another commonly proposed benefit of using a virtual environment for sports training is the possibility of augmenting the perceptual information presented to the athlete to help speed learning. This can involve things like visually highlighting locations that expert performers are known to look at when performing the action, or providing some sort of auditory or tactile feedback about one's movement. In terms of presenting visual information, this approach has generally proven to be ineffective when using video. For example, see the anticipation and gaze training study on beach volleyball players I discussed in episode 24C. In terms of virtual environments, there have been a few attempts to do this. For a really poor attempt at it, check out the catching system that is being developed by Disney that I discussed in my vlog number 3. As I discuss, I don't think this will work well because the information they're adding to the environment, basically a line which predicts the future path and landing point of the ball, is not compatible with the perceptual information that people actually use to catch a ball in this situation, which is prospective, not predictive. In the basketball free throw study I mentioned a few moments ago, Kovaci and colleagues included an augmented condition in which the optimal path of the ball to the hoop, calculated using data from expert shooters, was illustrated using a series of ellipses that were placed along the ideal ball trajectory. Interestingly, with this visual guidance present, the speed and launch height of the shots made by the novices in the virtual environment were closer to what occurred for novices in making real shots. So in other words, the visual augmentation helped improve the absolute functional fidelity of the simulation, but did not make the novice shooters behave more like experts. I've actually been playing around with using augmented information in my batting simulator recently in a study in which I tried to train batters to hit the ball in the air instead of on the ground. For this, I had the ball change color depending on the area the batter made contact with it, and I gave visual feedback about the launch angle. In my opinion, augmenting the feedback you give to an athlete in a virtual environment after they perform the action is likely to be a more fruitful approach than trying to augment information online during action execution. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done here. Question number 9. Is there any evidence of transfer of training from virtual to real environments in sports? Okay, I've danced around it long enough. Let's look at the very small set of studies that have addressed this key question. In 1997, Todorov investigated transfer of training from a virtual table tennis trainer. In this study, a group that was trained by a coach while performing real table tennis was compared to a group that was trained in a virtual environment which contained an image of the table, ball, and the user's paddle, which was linked to their actual paddle movements using a motion tracker. There was also the sound of paddle ball contact in the simulation. The simulated environment was displayed on a 15-inch computer monitor. The key ingredient in the study was that a second paddle was also displayed in the simulation, which showed the movements of an expert player, the coach, when hitting a shot. So in other words, the desired paddle trajectory was superimposed on the learner's paddle trajectory, in a system similar to the Visuomotor system used for observational learning, which I talked about in episode 63. In the table tennis simulator, there were also 2 other modes, one in which the movements of the coach's paddle were slowed down so they're easier to follow, and one in which the second paddle followed the learner's movements instead of the coach's. During training, the simulated started in slow-mo mode, switched to the mode where participants only saw their own movements, then finally switched to the coach's movements at full speed. So although this is a pretty lo-fi simulation, I really like the design of the study. Essentially, they were comparing a traditional training program where a coach gives verbal instructions with a virtual system where the coach is demonstrating the movement over and over. I think these are pretty comparable and rule out a lot of the problems you get with other studies like placebo effects. In the first experiment of their study, 3 groups were compared. A 10-participant control group that received traditional coaching and played real table tennis. A 19-participant training group that trained in the table tennis simulation, and a 13-participant pilot group that trained in a simulation which was identical to what I've described, except the ball was not displayed. Only paddle movement could be seen. 50 pre- and post-training tests were conducted for all groups, which involved hitting a real ball with a real paddle at a target on a real table. What was found? In terms of the target hits, the group that trained in the full simulation showed a significantly greater improvement than the other 2 groups. The coaching group was second, with the pilot group coming in last in terms of training effects. In a second experiment, a more difficult shot task was used. Essentially, a barrier was placed on the table that participants could either attempt to hit over or under. A coached, 11-participant real table tennis control group was compared to a group of 10 that trained in the full simulation. Again, the increase in the number of target hits was significantly greater for the group that trained in the sim. When they examined movement kinematics, not surprisingly, the difference between the movements of the coach's paddle stroke and the participant's stroke was smaller for the group that trained in the simulation than the control group. However, there were a couple interesting twists to this. First, for the simulation training group, the difference between the coach and the participant initially got smaller with training, as one would expect, but then began to increase again near the end. It was not the case that all participants that trained in the virtual environment exactly copied the coach's paddle stroke. In many cases, participants used part of it, for example, drawing it back in the same manner, but added their own individual variation. So I think the results of this study are very promising. Not only was there positive transfer from virtual to real training, but the magnitude of improvement was greater than for real practice. I think it's also very encouraging that there seems to be some sort of self-organization going on during learning in the virtual environment. But I do have a couple caveats. First, the results from the condition in which the ball was removed shows that you need to get the design of the virtual environment correct for good transfer. And second, of course, This was not a direct comparison between real and virtual practice because the simulation was augmented by showing the coach's paddle movements. In 2011, Lampham and Gopher examined transfer for a virtual reality juggling trainer. In this study, 12 participants trained for 10 days in both real juggling and with virtual juggling, and were compared to a 12-participant control group that experienced 10 days of training in real juggling only. The number of consecutive juggling cycles was the main dependent variable. The virtual environment was a very low-fidelity simulation in which the juggler could control simulated representations of their hands to juggle balls on a 2D wall display. So, essentially the simulation could be used to learn some of the perceptual cognitive aspects of juggling, but did not accurately recreate the motor component. The simulation also allowed participants to practice juggling at lower speeds than were possible in reality, and gradually increase the speed as they improved. What was found? After training, both groups improved by the same amount for normal juggling speeds. However, when forced to juggle at higher speeds, the group that received the additional VR training performed better than the control group. So again, some evidence of promise. I particularly like that in their simulation they used conditions that were not possible in real juggling, and the difficulty was adaptive to the user's skill. I've been using a similar adaptive approach for training in my batting simulator. In an article published in 2013, Rauter and colleagues investigated transfer of training for a very high-fidelity rowing simulation they developed. This virtual environment included a large cave display of the water, realistic sounds of the boat moving through the water, and oars that were attached to a series of ropes that delivered highly realistic haptic feedback to the rower. In the training study, 4 participants trained in the simulation, and a separate 4 did real training on the water, where they received verbal feedback from a coach. All had previous rowing experience but had never competed. Training involved 4 60-minute sessions for both groups. Pre- and post-training tests were conducted in both the simulator and on the water. These involved participants attempting to produce their best rowing technique. Performance was evaluated in different ways, including several biomechanical measures specific to rowing technique and video analysis by an independent rater. What was found? During training, there was evidence of good relative fidelity in the biomechanics, but poor absolute fidelity. For example, when the depth of the blade in the water was examined, the depth in the virtual environment was roughly 50% smaller than on real water. However, the change in this variable with practice was similar for both groups. Not surprisingly, the variability of stroke biomechanics was much smaller in the simulator, where conditions were always the same, in comparison to on the water, where there can be changes in wind and waves. But what about transfer? Interestingly, transfer seemed to occur in both directions. For the biomechanical measures, participants that trained in the simulator and then were tested on the water improved on 17 of the performance measures, while participants that were trained on the water then tested in the simulator improved on 13 in the simulator. These improvements were not as large as when considering the independent rater's analysis, however, as on average only improvements on 7 of the measures were found. So in sum, although there's some noise in the results due to the low sample size, there seems to be good evidence of transfer training. I also commend the authors for using pre- and post-tests in the simulator for both groups. I think this is a component that is missing in a lot of studies. The next study I wanted to briefly mention is one that I already discussed back in episode 10. This was a study published by Turp and colleagues in 2015, which looked at transfer of training from the darts game in Microsoft Kinect to real darts. In this study, 3 groups were compared: a group that practiced real darts, one that played the Kinect game, and a control group that did no practice. There were 15 shot pre- and post-tests on a real dartboard, and the training involved 3 sessions of 50 throws. The interesting twist to this study was that the quiet eye duration, that is the amount of time the thrower fixated on the target before releasing the dart, was measured. Both the real and virtual training groups showed significant improvements in throwing accuracy on the real dart post-test, with the real group doing slightly better. The quiet eye duration increased for both groups after training, and interestingly, it increased more for the virtual training group. So again, good evidence of transfer. And although this study involved a fairly lo-fi simulation, I commend the authors for measuring both performance outcomes and looking at the underlying processes. Finally, I briefly want to mention my baseball batting study that I'll be submitting for publication in a few weeks. In this study, I trained experienced baseball players in my batting simulation using an adaptive protocol, which involved performance-based adjustments of pitch speed, location, and spin rate using staircase methods. 80 participants were assigned equally to groups undertaking adaptive hitting training in the simulator, extra sessions of batting practice in the simulator, extra sessions of batting practice in a real batting cage, and a control condition involving no additional training to the player's regular practice. Training involved 2 30-minute sessions per week for 6 weeks. Performance in a game in the simulator, in a batting cage, and on a pitch recognition test were measured pre- and post-training. Where available, league batting statistics were also analyzed for the players for a 5-year period following the training. To foreshadow the results that I will be discussing in detail in a future episode, for all performance measures, the adaptive simulation training group showed a significantly greater increase from pre to post training as compared to the other groups. In addition, players in this group had superior batting statistics in league play and reached higher levels of competition. So, to sum up, I think there are a lot of positive signs pointing to the effective use of virtual environments for sports training. In general, research has shown that they mostly achieve good functional fidelity, that they can create reasonable levels of competitive anxiety, that they retain expertise differences, that they can encourage an external focus of attention, that they increase motivation and engagement in training, and the handful of transfer studies that have been done have not only showed positive transfer of training to real sports, but actually greater training gains for the virtual than the real training. However, there are some important things that still need to be addressed. First, there are some issues with perceptual fidelity, in particular misperception and uncertainty about locations of objects in the virtual environment, that have shown to lead to movement patterns that are quite different than for the real skill. Second, due to the cognitive effort that seems to be required to make the actions realistic, there seems to be different patterns of learning involved in the simulator, in particular more explicit and cognitive, and less implicit processes. Given the proposed benefits of implicit learning for sports, this needs to be investigated. And finally, research has shown that the best outcomes are not achieved by simply making the highest fidelity simulation possible with the largest field of view. The effects seem to be much more subtle than this, so a lot of research is needed to determine which parameters of a virtual environment are critical for effective transfer to occur. I am, of course, biased, but if I was a manager of a sports team, I would seriously consider looking into investing in a virtual environment for training, after, of course, doing a lot of legwork to evaluate one using the criteria I mentioned in my last episode. There seems to be a lot of good evidence pointing to their benefits. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Coming soon, in my final episode in this series, I will look at what we've learned about motor control, sports skills, and motor learning by using virtual environments as a research tool. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or on Twitter @ShakyWeights. And to find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.